Informed Choice Radio, episode 524. What an international tax lawyer thinks about a one-off wealth tax in the UK.
Live from Sundial House Studios, this is Informed Choice Radio. Want to make the most of your money and your life? You've come to the right place. Now, here's your host, Martin Bamford.
What does an international tax lawyer think about the introduction of a one-off wealth tax in the UK? The Wealth Tax Commission has published proposals to bring in the tax as a way to balance the public books following the coronavirus crisis. Marilyn McKeever is a partner at BDB Pitmans in their private wealth team. She specialises in international and UK tax planning. She works primarily with international individuals and families, and in this episode of Informed Choice Radio explains how a one-off wealth tax might work in the UK. Here's my conversation with Marilyn McKeever in episode 524 of Informed Choice Radio. Marilyn, perhaps you could start by introducing yourself. So tell us a bit about you and what you do at BDB Pitmans.
Well, I'm a partner in the private wealth team at BDB, and my clients are mainly individuals with international connections. So that might mean someone who comes from abroad and who is living in the UK for the time being. It might be they're a member of a family with international members, international businesses, or it might be a UK person who has a holiday home in the south of France. It's quite a wide practice.
Fantastic. And I hear that description of your clients and I immediately think that sounds complicated, but I'm sure you're well versed in all the many different situations they find themselves with. We're talking today about this idea of a one-off wealth tax. So perhaps you could tell us a bit about what is the proposal? I think we would have seen headlines in the last week or so about it. What's the idea behind this?
Well, I think everybody recognises that the coronavirus pandemic has left a large black hole in the public finances. And there's quite a lot of support. I mean, the government has poured a lot of money into it, trying to support individuals and businesses and so on. And I think people recognise also somehow and somewhen that has to be paid for. And the £260 billion question is how? And the Wealth Tax Commission has come up with this idea for a wealth tax. And I think it's worth mentioning at the outset that the Wealth Tax Commission isn't a government body and hasn't produced this at the behest of the government. They're a group of very eminent academics and practitioners who've put this forward as a suggestion as to how this might be dealt with. And I mean, it's a very impressive piece of work, and the tax itself is very well designed, although there will be a debate. And what they say the wealth tax should do is, first of all, raise revenue. Secondly, it should be efficient in the sense that the costs should be low compared with the revenue raised, and also that it shouldn't distort the behaviour of individuals and make them do different things they might not have done before. That it should be fair, which I think is really where the crux of this lies and where there will be the most debate around what is fairness. That it should be difficult to avoid, and that it should be better than the alternatives, which seem quite a good set of. So what are they? A good set of criteria. So what are they proposing? Well, they're proposing a one-off tax. They do emphasise it should be a one-off tax where there will be a snapshot of a person's wealth at a particular point in time. And then the headline rate of tax is 5% on the value of that wealth, although it would be payable, if people want to, over a period of 5 years at 1% a year.
Right.
It will be a very broadly based. It will include all assets that someone owns. So that includes your home, your pension pot, and your business, as well as investments and other assets, you'd be allowed to deduct mortgages and other debts and low value assets. So, your furniture and cups and saucers and things would not be included, but essentially it's intended to cover everything.
Okay.
They've also, as I say, it's a very well designed tax designed to prevent avoidance.
Yes.
And one of the ways they suggest this could be done is, should the government take up the suggestion, they suggest that they should just announce, today, as of today, we want to know how much, the value of everything you own, and a wealth tax will be imposed on it.
So not giving people enough notice to go and squirrel money away somewhere else or leave the country. Yeah.
Well, leaving the country won't work either, because even if people are thinking, oh my goodness, they might introduce a wealth tax, I'm off. The suggestion is that anybody who has been living in the UK within 3 years before the date of that announcement would also be caught, although obviously there are issues about enforcement and compliance in those sorts of circumstances. But it's certainly intended to be extremely broad-based and to reduce the opportunities for people to mitigate or avoid, depending on your point of view.
Absolutely, yes. And you mentioned a few things in the description of this wealth tax proposal. One is this issue of fairness. And I guess also this issue of the alternatives, because we've heard now for weeks, for months, that the Chancellor is going to have to raise taxes at some point to get the public books back in balance. And I guess the alternative to a one-off wealth tax, well, there's a few alternatives, but one of them is a more broad-based rise of day-to-day taxes, income tax, national insurance, VAT, etc. So how do we weigh the two up and think, okay, is it either or do you think it could be a combination of the two that's needed?
Well, I mean, one of the things which I think is extremely important with the wealth tax, and one of the things which I haven't yet said, is where the threshold is, what is wealthy.
Yes.
Now, the suggestion is, if you want to raise £260 billion in fairly short order, then wealthy means £500,000. Which is anybody with a semi-detached in Bexleyheath and a small pension pot.
Yes.
It clearly weighs disproportionately on London and the South East, although it's still a relatively modest amount of money across the country. And also, particularly given that pensions are included, it will disproportionately affect older people, those approaching retirement, and so on. And really, this idea of fairness is going to be at the heart of the debate. And it's a debate which needs to be had, because the government has spent enormous amounts of money and something will have to be done sooner or later. And I think one of the issues, perhaps the main issue, is what are you trying to achieve? Are you trying to raise revenue? In which case, yes, you do need a wide base and a low threshold, because, for example, the report indicates that with a threshold of £500,000, you can raise that 260 billion within the 5-year period. If, for example, you raised the threshold to £2 million, then you'd only raise 80 billion.
Right, that's a significant difference. I mean, it's still a lot of money, but compared to what the government needs to raise to balance the books, it's a big difference.
Exactly, and the higher you put the threshold, the less revenue it raises. Or the other alternative is, are you trying to reduce inequalities? So is it a political objective rather than an economic objective? And again, I think it's worth mentioning that the Wealth Tax Commission, the members of it are supported by, and it's been sponsored by, the International Inequalities Institute at the LSE. And this is certainly something that's touched on in the report. But there's a clear tension there. If you want money, it might be unfair, in inverted commas, if you are trying to exclude ordinary people who've worked and saved and have a house and pension. then you're not going to raise the money you need. So how do you balance the books? Very good question. I mean, they do look at alternatives. I mean, one of the things they looked at and dismissed was an annual wealth tax. This is something which has been tried in a lot of other European countries, and most of them have abolished it. I think it's only Spain, Switzerland, and Norway which still have an annual tax. And they, their rates have reduced and their thresholds have increased. It was basically very costly to administer, and it simply didn't raise the revenue. And it was too easy to avoid, and it just didn't work.
So a one-off approach seems to be the favoured option from them. But listening to that explanation, Marilyn, I guess the logistical challenges of trying to tax assets you mentioned there, property, pensions, business assets as well. So we come across lots of clients, as I'm sure you do, who are asset rich but cash poor.
This is
So how would they go about addressing that?
Well, they have suggested, so first of all, they have laid down, suggested criteria for determining whether somebody is liquidity constrained, is the expression they use, yes. i.e. they haven't got cash. So the typical person, would be the 80-year-old widow with a small pension, but a big house she's been living in for 40 years. And others you might not think of as, as necessarily being cash poor, but people like, farmers. Often they depend on subsidies. They, no pun intended, plough the profits back into the farm and so on. In many cases, business people will have their, be reinvesting the profits into the business. So while in theory they might be worth a lot of money, how much cash have they got in the bank might be a very different story. And again, with pensions, if you're, in your 30s or 40s, you simply have no right, you can't get the money. So they do have proposals for that. And particularly with pensions, for example, it's suggested that would not be payable until you reach normal retirement date, when it would be taken out of the cash-free lump sum or other pension assets. And of course, part of it is, well, why should somebody who saves for retirement via a pension be in a better position than somebody who saves through buy-to-let properties? So everything should be taken into account. But there is a certain tension between government policy on the one hand to encourage people to save for retirement through pensions, with auto enrolment and so on. And then on the other hand, when you get to retirement and need the money, they're saying, actually, we'll have our tax now, please. It's also suggested that although it can be paid over 5 years, if people are poor enough or cash poor enough, then they may be able to pay over a longer period.
Right.
But they are looking at, that's only in extremis. People might just have to sell their assets. Businesses might have to declare dividends, which could otherwise be reinvested. But people might have to borrow against their illiquid assets, which is going to just ratchet up the problems, because then they've got to pay interest on the borrowings as well as the tax. So those, I think, are some of the concerns, sort of one of the major concerns about the idea of this tax. And other things, or what happens if 2 years in there's a market crash and all of a sudden people's assets aren't worth as much as they were. There isn't really...
And that's because they'd be taking a snapshot of the value of your assets on day one and basing the tax for 5 years on that original valuation.
Exactly.
Gosh, yes, yeah. And I guess politically as well, this isn't a particularly palatable move. I'm thinking at the moment we've got a Conservative government. Their voters tend to be older. They tend to be wealthier than some of the other parties. So politically, that would be a tough sell for that voter base.
It would be a very tough sell. And I think one of the things the report says is that it's got to be credibly a one-off tax if there's to be any hope for selling it. But of course, once you get into the political arena, I mean, remember, income tax was a very short-term measure to pay for the Napoleonic Wars, wasn't it?
Apparently so, yes. Yeah.
And here we are 200 years later. And if it does raise the money, which it's anticipated it would raise, what's to say a government 5 years down the line of whatever complexion might decide, this is rather a good idea. I think
let's do it again. Absolutely.
Let's do it again. Yeah. And when you've got those kind of worries, even with a sort of tail, if you do emigrate, a lot of people like my clients who are internationally mobile, they like being here, but they don't have to be. They've got other places to go. And if they do go, even if they have to pay a wealth tax that was introduced, the country will be losing the literally billions of pounds that these people pay in income tax, in VAT. They'll be losing the businesses they set up and the jobs they create. It'll be putting off people who might come to the UK and pay lots of tax and create lots of jobs and businesses from coming here. So it's a very difficult question. I don't think there is any right answer, and I think this paper is very helpful in starting the debate. But there clearly will be a debate.
I'm sure there will, and it was fascinating to see the headlines this paper generated, because as you say, this didn't come from a government department. This came from an independent think tank, effectively. It followed hot on the heels, I think 2 weeks earlier, of a government paper about capital gains tax reform, which I don't believe was as widely reported, but is certainly getting the tongues wagging in our circles. It's getting lots of clients thinking about selling assets ahead of a possible budget in March. So the law of unintended consequences, whenever we talk about tax changes, I think is one to look at. And you mentioned there internationally mobile individuals, high net worth individuals. Could this mean people simply abandon the UK if there's a real prospect of it? And the UK is worse off as a result?
Well, I think it could, yes. I mean, when all the changes to the rules for non-domiciliaries were changed in 2017, so a non-domiciliary is a person who is resident in the UK, they live here, but they really belong to another country. They've come from abroad and that's their home. And there are special rules, and they were changed in 2017. And there was a lot of anecdotal evidence of very wealthy people who had huge businesses here, paid lots of tax here, leaving and going and living elsewhere. And I'm sure the introduction of this kind of measure could well have that kind of effect again.
Yes, and of course it's much easier these days, particularly post-pandemic, to live anywhere in the world, because as long as you have an internet connection and you can use Zoom for your meetings, we're seeing countries like I think Portugal and the Bahamas are now actively attracting British remote workers to say, well, why not come and have the lifestyle you can have here on the Algarve, in the Caribbean? Why not?
Yeah, well, exactly. I mean, for years the UK was trying to attract international businesses, and indeed, the government has recognised over the years that these people do have a very positive impact on the economy and are good for the country. But now there's lots of competition. I mean, not just Portugal and Bermuda, Italy has a non-dom regime. Switzerland for years and years has been a very popular place with expats. There are many places all around the world which are saying, well, if you don't like the UK anymore, come to us.
Lower taxes, better sunshine. What's not to like? I think I can see the attraction.
Especially the better sunshine.
Yes, absolutely. Marilyn, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for joining us to go through those proposals and help us get our heads around it a little bit better. Where can we find out more about BDB Pitmans and about your work?
Well, you can find it out at bdbpitmans.com. And if you look at our people and look for Marilyn McKeever, you'll find me there.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed today's show. At Informed Choice, our independent financial planners help remove stress about money by offering a clear explanation of your choices and options. We help people just like you find answers to the big financial questions, making sure you can live a meaningful life as a result. Thank you for listening. Be sure to subscribe to Informed Choice Radio to receive an update each time a new episode is published. If you enjoy our podcast, please leave a review or a star rating by clicking the podcast title artwork in Apple Podcasts or your favourite podcast player. You can find the show notes for this episode along with useful links by visiting icradio.co.uk. To find out more about Informed Choice, visit our website at icfp.co.uk, or you can find us on social media at Informed Choice. Thank you again, Marilyn, for being our guest today. Our producer is Emma Hill and our editor is James Spooner. Until next time, I'm Martin Bamford, and when it comes to your money, the more you know, the faster it can grow.